media, there's a term called wicked problems. And I think a lot of life can be viewed through that lens. You're never going to solve the most interesting challenges of your life. They're perpetual, and that's what allows you to continue to grow and learn and all that. On the right of a representation of the multi scale nature of wicked problems are a set of tools you can use to better manage complexity in your life and in your world. The illustration aims to highlight how you have localized complexity in your life, which is embedded in your sort of family, community, highway, house, workplace, domains of complexity. All those are embedded or share lithographic dirt, think earth, hydrographic water, we're made of water, we drink water, we swim, atmospheric, we breathe, we share the air. Then you could say anthropomorphic, having to do with humans. And it's also good to break out the noosphere, the mind sphere. It's called nous in Greek. And then subsequently, it's been called the sort of knowledge space, the collective thoughts of humanity taken in aggregation and written down quite often. All these domains have complexity. Therefore, they have wicked problems that can or cannot be solved. A good way of getting a grasp on complexity, to get a handle on it, is to use the 6 handles shown on the right of the top image. You have objects, people, places, things, relationships that form networks of interconnectivity. There's a diverse kinds of connectivity between the things in your world and in your experience and in your mind. And all this together forms a structural complexity. This is not true of all things. I mean, many things live in a very simple context. But if you step back for a moment, that simple context is always embedded in larger spaces. And not just three-dimensional spaces, but conceptual spaces, attribute spaces, and so on. That brings us to dynamic complexity. Any given state is like a point in a river as it moves. It evolves, some things less quickly, rocks, some things more quickly, farts. Taking all this together, from farts to rocks, you end up with a sort of meta-complexity. So what's the Overton window? The Overton window is on a wiki page. It's the edges of the conversation, or the domain of thought in which you're dwelling. It's your boundaries at whatever scale you're so inclined to walk. In the middle are kind of your operational state or societal operational states, like policies, the principles, the laws, the rules you live by. And as you go out from yourself, you can start to do consensus or surveys and see what is popular, and then that is in itself a option among many. There's many popular views, and even greater than that diversity of popular perspectives are the sensible ones. There's far more sensible ways to do things than you're able to do them. You can hammer a nail with a hammer or use other things. Anyways, beyond the sensible are the acceptable, and beyond the acceptable are the radical. and beyond the radical is the unthinkable. So I'm going to sort of wrap up the monologue by highlighting that you can remember those handles I mentioned earlier above, which are the essential properties of systems. Systems are best perceived as sort of networks of entities that interrelate with each other, and it's evident in all the sciences how they. It's sort of the paper on which they write. One way to gain perspective is to have a lens, or what I'll call an insight, that can be spelled out with the word Satori, which is a Japanese word, sort of, I think it may be Zen related or Buddhist. But it's Japanese, and it means instantaneous enlightenment. And it's a good metric to keep in your life. How quickly can you get from query, who, what, where, when, how, why, to answer? And what are the questions you're asking? Are they the right questions? Because it seems a lot of people in the popular domains these days ask their questions in contexts that have boundaries that may not be sensible. So that's an opinion. Coming back to Satori, you can see the world as a series of spaces, subspaces. That's the S. A stands for attributes. That would be your quantitative and qualitative describers, the names, the properties, age of a given entity. We're going to use entity as a broader concept that in the taxonomy of concepts, an entity includes both objects and relations between objects, points and edges, which you can scale up into higher dimensions into volumetric and hypervolumetric shapes. And I think 8 dimensions is enough for those who are maybe bored by elucidation of fundamentals of information theory as it relates to geometry. T is time. So you have space that have attributes, things happening in time, and that's the dynamic aspect. Which brings us back to an implicit notion of object. There's things, entities, which themselves can be spaces. In encapsulation, a sphere has on its envelope an outer, an inner, and a meso aspect to the boundary. And whether it's an object entity or relation entity, there's going to be nested patterns associated with either those relations or those entities. You can see yourself on the ground or 10,000 foot above. You can measure your bank account or the GDP of a country. The same thing, just viewed from different perspectives and with obviously variable scope. That brings us to relations, as I've mentioned. So space, attribute, time, objects, relations, and then you have insights, because the gift or the curse of being human is that we're perspectival. We dwell, as Heidegger would say in Dasein, we dwell in the world and experience, and there's a dynamic relationship between the two. So insight can be thought of as a lens or perspective. And I'll describe this as a sort of holonic approach to data structures. And what I mean by that is that you can start with taxonomies, which are the parent, so to speak, of lists, indexes, or order, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's prime numbers, there's even and odds. That's the meta complication that's innate and embedded in any signifiable entity. There's lots of entities. Most of them we don't signify. The atom on your left pinky right now, you're not signifying that, but I just did. And that has a connection to attention. Well, that didn't go well. I'll work on that. I love the brain, the human brain. I think this part here that lives in the back of your brain, that's like the knowledge graph. Okay. You can see the other half of it there. Oops, I gotta work on how I'm presenting this. You see that there? I'm gonna move this. This is the tree of life, as some might call it if they're religious. And you can see the fetus, your original state is embodied at the root of the tree. You see that there? That's your sort of entry point into life. Oops. Because it's a hypertoroidal shape. Like the infant recursion of the torus occurs across scale. So this part of your brain, so you're connected to the tree of life, and then you emerge, and this is your sort of lantern through which you embed kind of foundational functions. And then this is probably the inner you, so to speak, as far as it would be manifest in the brain. And I have the other half of that because it's bicameral. Over here, you can see there's parts of it that are highly articulated. But like the way I'm proposing you think about your brain is that it's the infolding of the outfolding of your world experience. And that what we've accumulated over time as a species is constructs of shared intelligence and experience, which topologically speaking are very similar to this part of the brain that we're looking at here. And if anyone knows the name of these parts, I would love help. Yeah, because I have a very primitive understanding of this. So I'm going to try to put the brain back together again. And one thing they've said historically, there's a really interesting phenomenon in early writings and early societies where people would go up to those statues that they built and they would talk to them. And it goes back before statues, back to caves when people would draw animals on the wall and talk to them. I'm going to have to take that off camera because of the position. And one thesis is, and it's in Homer, for example, you can read it. The people walk up to the statues and they talk to their gods. And I mean, earlier societies had a much closer connection. We're still sort of 1 foot in the state of nature, which we've not only won, but we've kind of become super organisms, just as our AI is now with us. But as they talk to the statues, they would ask questions of their gods, and their gods would respond. And one of the interesting thoughts I've heard on this is that what's actually happening is these two parts of the brain, the two halves of your brain, this half and the one that's not shown, weren't connected. There was I think it's the corpus callosum. And so the verbal part that speaks like I am right now would be hearing the nonverbal part, the part you're not hearing right now, but they would hear it as an external voice because they lacked that connection between two parts of their brain, which I find fascinating as a theory. And that around 2,000 years ago, give or take, I think it's more like 2,500, when you have guys like Socrates, and Plato, Buddha was around then, Aristotle. There's a lot of sort of I-aming all over the place. And I think it's hard to sort of, I'm not sure what to make of coincidences in time. But hey, if anybody wants to join, it's